Hey boys and girls, so I'm going to do our next chapters in Charlotte's Web. We had left off, we read chapters 6 and 7, now we're going to be on 8. And the last one, if you remember, Wilbur was crying because he had heard from the old sheep that the Zuckermans were going to use him for bacon and that he wasn't going to live, and so he was upset. And at the end of the chapter, Charlotte said that she was going to save his life, and we don't quite know yet how she's planning on doing that. So that's how we ended chapter 7. Now we're on chapter 8, which is called A Talk at Home. One Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arable and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. "Did you know that Uncle Homer's goslings have hatched?" said Fern. "How many?" asked Mr. Arable. "7," replied Fern. "There were 8 eggs, but 1 egg didn't hatch, and the goose told Templeton she didn't want it any more, so he took it away." "The goose did what?" asked Mrs. Arable, gazing at her daughter with a worried look. She told Templeton she didn't want it any more," said Fern. "Who's Templeton?" said Mr. Arable. "He's the rat," said Fern. "None of us like him very much." "Who's us?" said Mr. Arable. "Oh, everybody in the barn, Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the goslings and Charlotte and me." "Charlotte? Who's Charlotte?" "She's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever." "Well, what does she look like?" "Well," said Fern thoughtfully, "she has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess." "Charlotte is a spider?" asked Fern's mother. Fern nodded. "Yes, a big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and drinks their blood. Wilbur just adores her." "Does he really?" said Mrs. Arable rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried look on her face. "Oh, yes, Wilbur adores Charlotte. Do you know what Charlotte said when the goslings hatched?" "Ooh, I haven't the faintest idea," said Mr. Arable. "Tell us." "Well, when the first gosling stuck its little head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner, and Charlotte was on her web. And she made a speech. She said, 'I am sure that every one of us here in the barn will be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on part of the goose, she now has something to show for it.' Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say?" Yes, I do," said Mrs. Arable. "And now, Fern, it's time to get ready for Sunday school, and tell Avery to get ready. And this afternoon you can tell me more about what goes on in Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending quite a lot of time there? You go almost every afternoon, don't you?" "I like it there," said Fern. She wiped her mouth and ran upstairs. After she left the room, Mrs. Arable spoke to her husband in a small voice. "I worry about Fern," she said. "Did you hear the way she rambled on about the animals, pretending that they talked?" Mr. Arable chuckled. "Maybe they do talk," he said. "I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's just got a lively imagination. Kids think they hear all sorts of things." "Just the same, I do worry," said Mrs. Arable. "I think I'll ask Dr. Dorian about her the next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do, and I want him to know how strangely she is acting about that pig. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well that animals don't talk." Mr. Arable grinned. "Maybe our ears are not as sharp as Fern's." Okay, that was a short chapter. That was chapter 8. Chapter 9 is called Wilbur's Boast. Do you know what boast means? Boast means bragging, when you brag about something like, "I'm the best runner out of everybody in the group." Okay, so Wilbur's going to be boasting or bragging about something. So, a spider's web is stronger than it looks. Although it is made of thin, delicate strands, the web is not easily broken. However, a web gets torn every day by the insects that kick around in it, and a spider must rebuild it when it gets full of holes. Charlotte liked to do her weaving during the late afternoon, and Fern liked to sit nearby and watch. One afternoon she heard a most interesting conversation and witnessed a strange event. "You have awfully hairy legs, Charlotte," said Wilbur, as the spider busily worked at her task. "My legs are hairy for a good reason," replied Charlotte. "Furthermore, each leg of mine has 7 sections." Wilbur sat upright. "You're kidding. 7?" No, I'm not, said Charlotte. Wow, those are fancy names, I would think, for those parts. Goodness, I don't think my legs have 7 sections. Well, said Charlotte, you and I lead very different lives. You don't have to spin a web. That takes real legwork. I could spin a web if I tried, said Wilbur, boasting. I've just never tried. Oh, he's bragging, isn't he? Well, let's see you do it, said Charlotte. Fern chuckled softly, and her eyes grew wide with love for her pig. Okay, replied Wilbur, you coach me, and I'll spin one. It must be a lot of fun to spin a web. How do I start? Well, said Charlotte, take a deep breath, she said, smiling. Wilbur, breathe deeply. Now climb to the highest place you can get, like this. Charlotte raced to the top of the doorway. Wilbur scrambled to the top of his manure pile. Very good, said Charlotte. Now, make an attachment with your spinnerets, hurl yourself into space, and let out a dragline as you go down. Wilbur hesitated for a moment, then jumped out into the air. He glanced hastily behind to see if a piece of rope was following him to check his fall, but nothing seemed to be happening. The next thing he knew, he landed with a thump. Oof, he grunted. Charlotte laughed so hard her web began to sway. What did I do wrong? Asked the pig when he recovered from his bump. Nothing, said Charlotte. It was a very nice try. I think I'll try again, said Wilbur cheerfully. I believe what I need is a little piece of string to hold me. So the pig walked out into his yard. Templeton, are you there? He called. The rat poked his head out from under Wilbur's trough. You got a little piece of string I could borrow? He asked. I need to spin a web. Yes, indeed, replied Templeton, who always saved everything. No trouble at all. Happy to oblige. He crept down into his hole, pushed the goose egg out of the way, and returned with an old piece of dirty white string. Wilbur examined it. That's just the thing, he said. Tie one end onto my tail, will you, Templeton? Wilbur crouched low with his thin curly tail toward the rat. Templeton seized the string, passed it around the end of the pig's tail, and tied 2 half stitches. Charlotte watched in delight. Like Fern, she was truly fond of Wilbur, whose smelly pen and stale food attracted the flies that she needed, and she was proud to see he was not a quitter and was willing to try again to spin a web. While the rat and the spider and the little girl watched, Wilbur climbed to the top of the manure pile, full of energy and hope. Everybody watch, he cried, and summoning all of his strength, he threw himself into the air head first. The string trailed behind him, but as he had neglected to fasten the other end to anything, it really didn't do any good, and Wilbur landed with a thud. Crushed and hurt, tears came to his eyes. Templeton grinned. Charlotte just sat quietly, and after a bit she spoke. Here's the pictures. Okay, so there's Templeton tying the string to Wilbur's tail. And there's Wilbur, jumping off his pile, trying to spin a web. Can he spin a web, though? No, he's not a spider, is he? Can you see Charlotte up there in the corner on her web? Yep, there it goes. You can't spin a web, Wilbur, she said. I advise you to just put the idea out of your mind. You lack 2 things needed for spinning a web. Well, what's that? Said Wilbur sadly. You lack a set of spinnerets, and you lack know-how. But cheer up, you don't need a web. Zuckerman supplies you with 3 meals a day. Why should you worry about trapping food? Wilbur sighed. You're ever so much cleverer and brighter than I am, Charlotte. I guess I was just trying to show off. Serves me right. Templeton untied his string and took it back into his hole, and Charlotte returned to her weaving. You don't need to feel bad, Wilbur, she said. Not many creatures can spin webs. Even men aren't as good as it as spiders, although they think they're pretty good and they'll try anything. Have you ever heard of the Queensboro Bridge? Wilbur shook his head. No, is that a web? Sort of. But do you know how long it took men to build it? 8 whole years. My goodness. I would have starved waiting that long. I could make a web in a single evening. What do people catch in the bridge? Bugs? Asked Wilbur. No, said Charlotte. They don't catch anything. They just keep going back and forth across the bridge, thinking there must be something better on the other side. They rush, rush, rush every minute. I'm glad I'm a sedentary spider. What does sedentary mean? Asked Wilbur. means I sit still a good part of the time and don't go wandering all over creation. I know a good thing when I see it, and my web is a good thing. I stay put and wait for what comes. Gives me a chance to think. Well, I'm sort of sedentary myself, I guess, said the pig. I have to hang around here whether I want to or not. You know where I'd really like to be this evening? Where? In the forest, looking for beechnuts and truffles and delectable roots, pushing leaves aside with my wonderful nose, searching and sniffing and smelling and smelling and smelling. You smell just the way you are, remarked the lamb who had just walked in. I can smell you from here. You're the smelliest creature in this place. Wilbur hung his head, and his eyes grew wet with tears. Charlotte noticed his embarrassment, and she spoke sharply to the lamb. You leave Wilbur alone, she said. He has the perfect right to smell, considering his surroundings. You're no bundle of sweet peas yourself. Furthermore, you're interrupting a very pleasant conversation. What were we talking about, Wilbur, when we were so rudely interrupted? Oh, I don't remember, said Wilbur. It doesn't matter. Let's not talk any more for a while. I'm getting sleepy. You go ahead and finish fixing your web. I'm going to lie here and watch you. It's a lovely evening. And Wilbur stretched out on his side. Twilight settled over the barn, and a feeling of peace. Fern knew it was almost supper time, but she couldn't bear to leave. She loved all the sounds that the barn made at this time of day. Wilbur lay there, remembering what the old sheep has told him, and he started to get afraid. Charlotte, he said softly. Yes, Wilbur. I don't want to die. Of course you don't, said Charlotte in a comforting voice. I just love it here in the barn. I love everything about this place. Of course you do, said Charlotte. We all do. The goose appeared, followed by her 7 goslings. They thrust their little necks out and kept up a musical whistling like a tiny troop of pipers. Wilbur listened to the sound with love in his heart. Charlotte, he said. Yes, said the spider. Were you serious when you promised you would help me? I was never more serious in my life. I'm going to help you, Wilbur. How are you going to save me? Asked Wilbur. Well, I don't really know, but I'm working on a plan. That's wonderful, said Wilbur. How's the plan coming, Charlotte? Have you gotten very far with it? Is it coming along well? Wilbur was trembling again, but Charlotte was very cool and calm. Oh, it's coming all right, she said lightly. The plan is still in its early stages and hasn't completely shaped up yet, but I'm working on it. When do you work on it? When I'm hanging head down at the top of my web. That's when I do my best thinking. I'd be only too glad if I could help in any way. Oh, I'll work it out alone, said Charlotte. I can think better when I'm alone. All right, said Wilbur, but don't fail to let me know if there's anything I can do to help, no matter how small. Well, you must try and build yourself up. I want you to get plenty of sleep and stop worrying. Never hurry and never worry. Chew your food thoughtfully and eat every bit, except what you have to leave for Templeton. Gain weight and stay well. That's how you can help. Do you understand? Yes, I understand, said Wilbur. Good, then go ahead and go to bed. Sleep is important. Wilbur trotted over to his dark corner of his pen and laid himself down and closed his eyes. In another minute he spoke again. Charlotte, he said. Yes, Wilbur. May I go out to my trough and see if I left any of my supper? I think I left just a tiny bit of mashed potato. Very well, but then I want you in bed without delay. Wilbur started to race out of his yard. Slowly, said Charlotte. Never hurry and never worry. Wilbur checked himself and crept slowly to his trough. He found a bit of potato and chewed it carefully. He closed his eyes then and went back to sleep. Charlotte, he said in a whisper. Yes. May I get a drink of milk? I think there are a few drops left in my trough. Nope, the trough is dry and I want you to sleep. Now close your eyes and go to sleep. It's sometimes like a little child, isn't it, who keeps wanting to get up for a drink? Wilbur shut his eyes. Fern got up from her stool and started for home, her mind full of everything she had seen and heard. Good night, Charlotte, said Wilbur. Good night, Wilbur. Then there was a pause. Good night, Charlotte. Good night, Wilbur. Good night. And good night. All right, that was the end of chapter 9. So we read 8 and 9. Now here's 10. All right, Chapter 10 is called An Explosion. Uh-oh, I wonder what's going to be happening in that chapter. And there's a quick peek at Charlotte there working on her web. So we will do chapter 10 next time. That was chapters 8 and 9. And I'm going to go get ready to see some of you who are stopping by. So have a great day, everybody.